Mario Matos. My name is Mario Matos. I am the vice chair of the FMG. And this today, Lou is traveling, so I have to turn to make this introduction. But really, it's a big issue. It's a topic that concerns all of us. Is the Trump trade policy and the WTO reform. On the one hand, it's clear that we don't know. We don't know, but the trade policy of the US is transforming the global trade norms and delivering the heaviest attack against the multilateral trading system, including WTO. At the same time, its objectives are not so clear, and therefore creating uncertainties and instability. To deal with this, we have an excellent list of speakers and a superb moderator, Stuart Harbinson, one of the greatest connoisseurs of the multilateral trading system. In fact, many years ago, many years ago, when I arrived to Geneva, I asked my staff where to turn to go for an global overview, a balanced one. And the answer was always Stuart Harbinson. So, Stuart, you will be the moderator. Go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mario. Thank you for your kind words. Those were happier days, I've got to say, on the WTO front. But anyway, we should crack on because time is short and it's a huge subject. This session is on Trump trade policy and WTO reform. I think given the bombshell that we experienced a week ago with the Liberation Day announcement, followed now by implementation, it's fair to say that most of us are probably in something of a state of shock and trying to work out what it all means. Of course, we're all very interested in WTO reform, otherwise we wouldn't be in this group. But in order to figure out what can or should be done on the WTO front, we really need to know where the US is headed and what that means for its trading partners and the trading system. So in this session, we're going to try to focus first of all on US trade policy, of course, and the initial reactions to it. And then hopefully there'll also be some time to make a start on thinking about what it means for the WTO. It's been said, I think, by very well-respected commentators that last week's announcement marks the end of a period of almost 40 years of incredible trade and wealth creation, and I must say poverty reduction, based essentially on optimization of global supply chains. But there's no doubting, of course, that there were losers as well as winners, and that the underlying geopolitics has shifted, creating instability in the system. Personally, I don't believe that globalization is finished for all sorts of reasons, notably technology, but it looks like there might now have to be some reconfiguration of trading relationships, either temporarily or permanently. Although last week seems already quite a long time ago, and stock markets have reacted negatively, we need to keep reminding ourselves, I think, that it's still very early days in this saga, and that it's also very fast moving. We're hearing in the last day or two that Japan is now heading the queue to negotiate with the US. The EU says it wants to negotiate, but I think we're all also expecting them to announce today a first raft of retaliation. And China, meanwhile, is in the process of being locked out of the US market because the tariffs now seem to be prohibitively high, but it says it's going to fight to the end. So where is all this headed? Inevitably, there are more questions than answers, and I'm not trying to put the pressure on anyone, but I've got to say we're very fortunate to have with us today this stellar cast of panel members. Should I call them victims, perhaps, of the FMG, who are, very well known and highly respected U.S. trade policy experts with very deep perspectives also on the multilateral trading system, and they're going to try to help us to decipher or disentangle this confusing situation to the extent that we can right now. Their CVs have been circulated, and so I hope you'll forgive me if I dispense with the formalities in that respect. But in any case, in this group, we're a very small group. We either know each other or we know of each other, so I don't think we need to spend time on that. I'll just finally add that I think our CEO, Lou, had in mind that this is unlikely to be our one and only session on this topic. And he wanted to focus pretty much on the US at this stage, which is, of course, natural enough. But I'm sure there are other angles that we'll also explore in future. Let me remind you also that this session is being recorded and it will be shared online afterwards. So with that, I'm going to now give the floor to each of our panelists for a few minutes each, which will be followed by some interaction between them before I open up the floor to the audience. And at that stage, of course, you can put your hand up to ask a question or pose a question in the Q&A function. So I'm going to turn first to Bill Reinsch. Welcome, Bill. Thanks very much for coming on early in the morning where you are. It's much appreciated. I got a couple of questions that I'd just like to pose to you to get the ball rolling. First of all, can you discern any or an underlying rationale to the tariffs announced last week, or is this all about making deals? And in terms of the international reaction, are we witnessing a stampede of governments to Washington? I think there were references to Japan, as I mentioned, being at the head of the queue, and a stampede of investors to the US as well. And also, I mean, given your previous incarnation as president of the National Foreign Trade Council for 15 years, I think it was. If you've got anything you can educate us on a little bit on in terms of the business reaction. Of course, business is a huge area and the different perspectives. But if you can just say a few words on that, that would be very well received as well. Thanks a lot. Over to you. You're muted, Bill.
Sorry about that. It's a pleasure to be back with you. The topic's not a pleasure, but it's always, I've been a fervent listener of the group, but it's nice to have a chance to talk. On your questions, there have been 4 reasons given for what he's doing. And I think the truth is probably all of them are part of the reasoning. He's emphasized different ones at different times. The 4 are: 1, I would say revenge, but he would say rebalancing. His longstanding view that the trading system discriminates against the United States, has been discriminating against the United States for 70 years, that our barriers are low and everyone else's are high, that we did that in order to facilitate post-war reconstruction, and it created this giant inequity that we are now being taken advantage of by the evil foreigners who are stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, and compromising our security. His whole narrative has been the victim narrative. The U.S. is a victim of these other things. And over the years, he's demonstrated he has one narrative, which is that he has one metric, which is a bilateral trade deficit, and he has one tool, which is tariffs, which is what he's exercising. So I think what's come out in the last couple of weeks is that the idea of restructuring the system in a way that favors the United States and enables him basically to get even with all the unfairness that he's accumulated or he's seen accumulating over the years is probably his main objective. Underlying that, of course, is his view that has absolutely no basis in reality, that the Americans don't pay the tariffs, the foreigners pay the tariffs. And of course, if you start thinking that the Americans don't pay, then imposing tariffs is easy because you don't see any downside. Virtually every economist in the country, except for Peter Navarro, have told him that's wrong, but he remains convinced. So that's goal number one. Goal number two, which has come out only in the last week, and there's been a lot of confusion about this, is that it's also a way to force negotiations into, I think from the other country's perspective, the negotiation is, can we make these things go away? And what do we have to do to make them go away? And Trump has set this up in I think, a clever way for himself. And we'll get to how countries are approaching this in a minute, but it makes him the center of attention. He wants people to come here, which they're doing, and Netanyahu was here yesterday, and various other countries are coming, and he gets to sit on the throne, and people will beg for mercy, and then he'll either grant it or he won't. He, I think, will end up driving a harder bargain than people think, because he doesn't. It's not just about other countries' tariffs; it's about other countries' unfair practices, which, despite what he said he was going to do, they've made really no effort to measure. And the formula they use to establish the tariffs bears no relationship to the extent of NTBs that exist in that particular country. It's a formula that, I mean, basically they just divide the bilateral deficit by the last year's imports from that country. I mean, they dressed it up with a lot of Greek letters, but that's what the formula amounts to. I think we can all go into greater detail if you want, but it does appear, based on his most recent statements, to no surprise, really, the guy's a deal maker, and he likes people coming to him and begging, and so he's open to this. I don't think he's going to turn down any phone calls. He's not going to turn down any visits. Whether it amounts to anything is a different question. I think my colleagues will have something to say about that. The third reason is revenue. That wasn't really an issue in his first term. It is now, because he needs revenue to pay for his tax cuts. There's an irony here, which I think you all understand, that tariffs are regressive. They're going to hit poor people harder. The tax cuts are the opposite. They're going to benefit the rich. So what he's really engineering is a giant income transfer from the poor to the rich in our country, which will exacerbate income inequality, which I think people will catch on to eventually. But revenue is not missing from his calculation here, because it's an important issue for what the Congress is doing right now on budget related issues. Our estimate, by the way, is that he'll take in roughly 330 billion US dollars a year. I think that was an estimate based before he added 50% addition to China. That'll probably stop trade. And of course, if you stop trade, then you stop the tariff revenue. So the real number will probably end up being lower. And then the final goal is he wants to force manufacturing to come to the US, either to return to the US if it's Americans that went abroad, or to come to the US if it's foreigners. He said repeatedly, if you make it here, there's no tariff. He's sort of ignoring the fact that even if that happens, and I think by and large it won't, and I can go into that if anybody cares, but even if it happens, it takes a long time. Decisions to invest, decision to build factories take time. Stellantis, which is used to be Chrysler, announced late last year they were going to reopen a factory in the state of Illinois, And this is not new. It's there. It's being closed. They're going to open it. They're going to retool it. They announced this in 2024. The start date is 2027. So even for that, you're talking 3 years. This may happen, but it's not going to happen very quickly. And meantime, all the tariffs are going to go into effect. So what's going to happen now? How are people reacting? First of all, he's going to get sued. Alan and I have had some extended conversations about, and Jennifer has written about, I thought very thoughtfully about the lawsuits, and I leave it to them to talk about that. There's one that's been filed already on the 20% China tariffs, and there are more in the works. So you can expect that to work its way through the courts. The pending lawsuit is not seeking an injunction to block the tariffs from going into effect. There will be future suits that do that. That'll be the question whether they can find a judge that will issue a stay to block the tariffs from further going into effect. My suspicion is that will be hard to do. But that's not a commentary on who's going to ultimately win the litigation. That's going to go on. Meanwhile, life will also go on. I think countries, I think right now are going through what has been described in a different context as the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Some of them are getting stuck in anger, China being a good example. Most of them are heading toward the bargaining stage. There's been this ongoing debate here, actually, because companies are faced with the same thing. Is it better to grovel and kiss the ring, or is it better to stand up to the bully? And they both have not worked, and they both have worked in the past. So it's very difficult to tell what the right strategy is. Right now, it appears that most people are pursuing the bargaining, groveling strategy. And we'll see how far they get with that. It's too soon to say. China has retaliated and will probably retaliate again to the 50% tariff. Canada has retaliated on autos only and not on anything else. We're expecting the EU, as Stuart said, to do something, although the debate today is over what to do about steel. I mean, there's kind of a month behind the times or 2 months behind the times, but they'll get there. Everybody else has either said they're not going to do it, they're not going to retaliate, or they are holding their fire temporarily while they decide what to do. And the line of countries coming in wanting to negotiate is getting longer. Secretary of Defense said yesterday it was 70. I have no idea what the 70 are. The ones that you know about are the Israelis, because Netanyahu was here the day before yesterday. And you notice he didn't get a deal. He made the case, and Trump basically said, thank you very much. And they talked about other things. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam are here, apparently, or on the way here at some decently high level. So we'll see how that ends up. Most of the countries seem to be making an initial offer of tariff elimination or tariff reduction. And some of them are doing it only with respect to the United States. In other words, they're abandoning the MFN, which I think is not good from the WTO standpoint, but that's where this seems to be heading. And I'm sure my colleagues will comment on that. I think where we're going to get into complicated territory is that the initial US reaction has been tariff elimination is not enough. You have to go further and address other issues. They mentioned the VAT, which Trump seems to regard as a subsidy, which is not correct. We can do the math to explain all that, but you all know all that. But if you start adding in the VAT, that ends up being a fairly significant barrier. 170 countries have a VAT. And that kind of illustrates the problem with this, because the demands the US is going to make on the NTB side, the VAT, SPS rules, for example, really are going to go to not tariffs, but how countries organize their economy and how countries organize their society. So I think it's going to be much more difficult for other countries to meet these demands, because there's going to be political pushback. in their own country. In the European case, for example, most of a lot of the NTBs that the U.S. complains about are in agriculture, which should be no surprise to any of you. So we're going to tell the Europeans, you got to take our chickens. It's one of my favorite topics. Well, for the European public, I think that's a public health issue. That's not a trade issue. And it's easy for the Americans to say they're wrong about that. But, if you're a European politician, dealing with the issue, you deal with these things at some peril, because what the U.S. is saying is, is going to say you need to get rid of the VAT. Most countries have decided that taxing consumption is a good thing, and I don't think they're going to just change the tax policy they've been following for decades to suit us when we're really an outlier as far as international tax policy is concerned. So I think this is going to be heading into rough waters, actually. I mean, if the United States is not going to be satisfied with tariff reductions and is going to demand more, then these are going to be very difficult negotiations and may end up with not very satisfactory outcomes. We've had a debate here about what an outcome might be. I don't think anybody's going to get below 10%, which is sort of the baseline. I have a colleague who worked in the first Trump administration who thinks I'm wrong about that and thinks that countries that are currently at 10%, which would be Singapore, Australia, the UK, and a number of others, have a shot at getting down to zero. FTA partners, I think, will argue that that's what they should get because they're already there. So I think all that has yet to play out. The interesting thing about it, of course, is that Trump's advisors are kind of, they're good cops and bad cops. And how you think about this depends a little bit on which cop you're listening to at the moment. The good cops tend to be the Secretary of the Treasury and the U.S. Trade Representative. The bad cops tend to be Peter Navarro and the Secretary of Commerce. In the end, this is an area where Trump personally is heavily involved, heavily invested, and he's going to make the decisions. Nobody else is going to make the decisions. And anybody who speaks for him runs the great risk, as has been demonstrated numerous times. He has contradicted Navarro, Bessent, and Lutnick at various times over the last month within a day of whatever they said. He's come back and basically said, that's not right. So anything that these people are saying should be taken with, a very large container of salt. And even Trump himself, has gone back and forth on these things. And if you look at the Canadian-Mexican episode, you can see that, they were on, they were off, they were up, they were down, they were postponed. This is the very definition of uncertainty. And he thinks that's good. Nobody else does, but that's what we're dealing with. With that, I'll stop. Stuart, back to you. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot about the companies. One word on the companies. I think most of them are waiting for the dust to settle, trying to figure out where things are going to settle. Once they settle, I think you're going to see a lot of tariff arbitrage as people, this is not good for anybody, but if you've got a supply chain that is heavily invested in parts and components of Vietnam and they stay at 46%, you're going to be looking to see if you can reconstruct your supply chains at countries that are at 10 or 20%. That's not great. It's more expensive and less efficient than the way the world used to operate. But 20% is better than 46%. So I think that's where we end up going. But I think companies are going to, for the most part, take their time getting there because they're a prisoner of the same uncertainty I just described. And with that, I really will stop.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Bill. I think you set the scene incredibly well and covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. So thanks a lot. There's a huge amount in there that I think we're going to circle back to later in the session. Things that you said struck a chord with me in many cases, particularly your reference to, whether countries in offering concessions to the US would do so on an MFN basis or not. One would think not, because Otherwise, the US might not be satisfied. But anyway, that's an interesting one. We'll come back to a lot of that, I'm sure. Wendy, can I turn to you now, please? And again, thanks very much for coming on early in the morning. Of course, Wendy, you're Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. So I've got a couple of sort of starter questions for you on relations with Asia, which has been hit pretty hard, obviously. And so my question, I guess, is, do you think that this is going to have a lasting effect on US relations with the region? And do you see, as a result of this tariff action, a sort of reconfiguration of trade relations, either within the region or between Asia and other regions like ASEAN, China, Asia, Middle East, Latin America, perhaps even BRICS action that some people have mentioned? Or do you think somehow that Asian economies will find a way of keeping themselves embedded in the US market? So over to you.
Hey, those are a lot of easy questions for so early in our morning, but Bill covered so much. Let me just add a couple of things to what Bill said, and then at least my perspective, and add a couple of things, and then try and address some of your questions. When I think of how countries are responding now, and I just wrote a piece about this in foreign policy. For me, there are like 5 buckets of responses, and one is announcing unilateral measures and making announcements, so appealing to Trump's transactional side. Second would be to actually negotiate deals, and here I'm thinking something in writing, and would include a number of matters of concern to the U.S., including some rules as well as tariff cuts. Retaliation is on the table as well. And here, I think Bill summed it up well. I would just say that in the past hour, China just announced counter retaliation. So China's tariffs are up at least, I think, 84% against the United States. Other countries, I call kind of this lying low strategy. And here I put a lot of the countries that are in the 10% bucket, or also, not a major, won't get airtime with an administration that is overworked trying to deal with, all of the folks coming to Washington and calling. And then finally, diversification, and that's been underway for a while. Many countries and companies since Trump 1.0 and COVID have been looking to diversify their markets, their sources of inputs. I think that's getting a major boost right now, and I think we're going to see more of that. Now, I would also say that some of these strategies and options can be pursued together, and we're seeing that as well. We're seeing countries thinking sequentially how we're going to work through this. In terms of countries that are in town now, and I've spoken to a number, Bill, depending who you listen to in the administration, they're in conversations with anywhere between 50 to 70 folks right now. But big delegations, including Vietnam, Japan, and Korea, are in town. And in talking to them and others, I think there is a big question about, are you better off trying to reach a quick deal with the Trump team, or is this something you should kind of watch how others are faring? And one of the key challenges is that our trading partners really don't know what, either what they're going to be asked, but I think also in many of these discussions with the administration, the burden may be on them to just announce what they're prepared to do. And we all know as former negotiators, that's an uncomfortable position to be in, because you can pocket all of this stuff. And our president has pocketed a lot of announcements made by countries and foreign companies over the past 2 months. And then they got no credit, quote unquote credit, when the tariff rates were assigned. And so I think countries making ad hoc announcements now, we may see that drying up a bit. Certain countries like Thailand and Israel have announced that they're willing to unilaterally cut some tariffs. And Vietnam has said they're prepared to go to zero for all tariffs. And my understanding is just for the United States. And I think that's something this group will probably want to talk more about. But it's not like they're doing that now. I think they want to sit down and have a negotiation, at least have some understandings with the administration. And one of the key concerns I'm hearing from other countries is that they want a moratorium on future tariff hikes. So in other words, if they go ahead and they do all this stuff and they make the administration happy and the reciprocal tariff is unwound, they don't want to be in the position 2 months from now or 6 weeks from now being hit with another tariff, either sectoral or for some totally unrelated reason. And I think that could become a sticking point in some of these negotiations. So those are some thoughts on the negotiations themselves. Maybe I would just then proceed and just say the Asian countries clearly were hit the hardest. They typically have not only the largest trade deficits with us, but they export the most to us proportionally. And so, their rates got high. We've seen Cambodia at 49%, Vietnam at 46%, other Southeast Asian countries coming in high, Japan, Korea, 24, 25. I will say Australia got 10. Bill alluded to this. Our FTA partners are just furious, because in their view, there are no tariffs there. So why are they being hit under this reciprocal tariff announcement? I think, so I, put that on the table. But putting China aside, and that's a big aside, I don't see the other countries retaliating for the time being. Their markets are smaller. They're dependent on the US market. It's kind of not their MO. And so I'm not precluding it, but I don't see that happening. And my conversations with former officials from many Asian countries would probably agree with me. Just a couple of things I thought maybe I'd just conclude with, things to watch and what I'm watching now. Number one would just be the impact of all these tariffs on the US economy, our stock market prices, et cetera. Because in the US, public opinion can shift quickly. And if folks are really feeling the pain, that will put pressure on the White House to to try at least to try and allay those concerns. But something to watch. Two, any early deals, which countries reach deals, and what's in those deals, because I think that's going to be instructive for other countries as well. And for those countries that come here and at least they leave here empty-handed, what can other countries learn from what did not work? So I think paying attention to to any deals reached or any kind of transactional announcements made with Trump and what's said are going to be very instructive and important for countries to watch. Reactions from our Congress and business will be extremely important. We're already seeing some Republican senators in particular, but some Republicans from the House as well, joining Democrats in sponsoring legislation to curtail the administration's, the executive branch's ability to regulate trade and to impose these tariffs. And we're hearing more and more Republican senators, congressmen express concern, particularly about particularly about farm exports. Next, sectoral tariffs. We need to watch those closely. There are two ongoing 232 investigations, one on lumber, one on copper. A couple of weeks ago, Lutnick said the copper 232 is not going to need the full year. So those tariffs may be announced soon. And if those 232 investigations are truncated, I think that will send a signal for other 232 investigations. There's talk about additional sectoral tariffs on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, maybe critical minerals. I think at least our thinking is that they would be also subject to 232 investigations. But, we'll see. Maybe the president wants to move more quickly. But definitely those are coming down the road. Now, some of those sectoral tariffs have not been applied on a stacking or an additive basis, so that's something to watch as well. Just two more things. I think, Bill alluded to this, but watching who's up and who's down and who's assigned which negotiations and who's not in the negotiating room is going to be very important to watch. We started seeing a mud fight yesterday between Navarro and Elon Musk on these tariffs. For the most part, the administration has been pretty united here, but I think we may see that some of that kind of unwind in the coming days and weeks, particularly as the stress on our economy and with our trading partners increases. For Japan, noteworthy that the administration has said that they have placed priority on that negotiation and that they're putting Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and Greer, the USTR, in charge of those talks. That suggests to me that they'll probably be looking at currency issues as well. But also of note, Lutnick is not in that group. Now, does that mean he's going to be busy with other countries? I don't know, but it's something to watch going forward. And then, I'll before I get to the last thing to watch, I would just say, I would not underestimate USTR Greer here. I think he's being, listening to advice of his mentor, Lighthizer. And if you look at Lighthizer during Trump 1.0, he did join the administration a little later than Wilbur Ross, but it was very clear that when he came in, things started to shift and the gravity of a lot of this work then moved to USTR. And just as an alum of USTR, I think that they have the tools, the knowledge of our trade laws, the relations with our trading partners, et cetera, to move to be an effective partner or leader on many of these negotiations. Finally, I would, just put on everyone's radar screen, we should look at, or particularly given this Chinese retaliation now, which, just to mention, many of our tariffs against China now are above 120%, and that's the prohibitive zone. And for our farm exporters, this is going to be a huge blow because the Chinese tariffs are at 84%. So it is conceivable that the administration will, again, like they did during Trump 1.0, offer financial assistance to our farmers and maybe others to help weather the storm. But I think that would give an indication of how long they think, all of this is going to unfold. So with that, let me stop.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Wendy. It's a tremendous tour of the region and the situation. Again, lots of things to pick up. I mean, you mentioned the sort of the negotiator's dream of sitting there and your negotiating opposite number coming to you and offering things, and you just keep quiet, and they just keep putting extra stuff on the table. It's marvelous.
Or you just keep saying not enough.
Yeah. It doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it's really nice. If it's you, of course, if you're the one doing the offering, it's not so nice. Yeah, and this point about prohibitive tariffs, I think, is a good one as well, amongst many other good points. I mean, there comes a point where you run out of ammunition with tariffs, isn't it? Because it can be 120%, it can be 200%. It's just the same, actually. So anyway, thanks very much, Wendy. We'll come back to some of that, I'm sure. Jennifer, thanks very much for also joining the call and sparing your time on a early morning like this. It's great. You've written some very illuminating commentaries, which I've read on President Trump's use of emergency powers, particularly the IEEPA, to impose tariffs. And so my sort of starter question for you would be, how would you rate the chances of legal challenges, and by whom, and with what sort of chances of success? And secondly, on the political front, do you think that the Congress is likely at some stage to want to reassert its authority over US trade policy and tariffs? And of course, long experience of the WTO and a member of the appellate body, etc. So what I'd like to ask you, what lessons do you think the WTO can learn in terms of how to deal with these very, very challenging national security or economic security issues? So over to you, Jennifer.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. And I'm really delighted to be here and want to thank both Bill and Wendy for their really helpful and insightful comments to sort of tee this up. So I'll just start with, look, there's already started to be litigation challenges. And so let me just explain really quickly, again, the basis of those challenges. Obviously, as almost all of you on this call know, the basic claim that is being made is that this is, in essence, the largest tax increase in the United States since the 1940s, putting our tariff rates back to levels we haven't seen since 1909, all without Congress, without an act of Congress. And so it sort of begs this constitutional question of how is that possible that, again, one person, the president, can in essence do this much within our economy, within our constitutional system. And so the gist of these pieces that I've written, and I think at the core of the litigation that you're going to see, is this basic claim of, does this International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or IEPA, as many call it, does it actually provide the president with the authority to impose tariffs? And again, I've written, and I think a number of others have written, that the answer to that question is no. And again, I will say there is clearly debate over this, but my basic argument is that, and particularly recently, you have seen the Supreme Court, this particular Supreme Court, these 9 justices, articulate something that is referred to as the major questions doctrine. And it basically says that if there is an issue that is a major question, meaning it has a major impact on the U.S. economy, the U.S. interpretation of its authorities, there has to be a very clear delegation. In one instance, the words was crystal clear delegation of power from the Congress to the executive branch to do whatever this is. And this major questions doctrine was used against some of the actions taken in the Biden administration. For example, the forgiveness of student loans. The question was whether Congress had clearly delegated to the Department of Education this ability to do this forgiveness of loans. With respect to actions that were taken by the Environmental Protection Agency to, in essence, regulate greenhouse gases. The issue was, did the Congress clearly delegate in the Clean Air Act in the 1970s the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, which were not a concern in the 1970s. And again, the court in both of those instances said, no, you cannot read into the Clean Air Act the ability to regulate greenhouse gases. Congress did not clearly delegate that authority. So for me, I then look at this IEPA statute, which came out of an older statute, the Trading with the Enemy Act, was enacted, in the 1970s in the United States. Does it clearly delegate the authority from the Congress that the Constitution says is the only entity that can impose taxes or tariffs, is the Congress? Did Congress clearly delegate to the president the authority to impose tariffs under this IEPA Act? And again, my argument is the answer to that is no. Why? A, because IEPA does not contain anywhere the words duty or tariff. So there is no reference to duties or tariffs as a power expressly delegated under IEPA. Secondly, under IEPA, there is no process at all to determine how much these tariffs or duties would be. And I say that in contrast to the other statutes that do that. In other words, our Section 232 on national security, our Section 201 on safeguards, our Section 301 on unfair practices, our anti-dumping, countervailing duty, safeguards, all of those, A, use the words like tariff or duty, and B, have a process by which everybody comes in and weighs in and says, okay, how much is the appropriate amount of these duties? And so, basically my argument is, one, the delegation isn't there. Therefore, IEPA does not provide the authority in order to do this. And the second part of IEPA is that even if you say there is tariff authority, there has to be a very clear connection between the emergency that has been declared and the action that has been taken. And so, particularly with respect to the first use of IEPA, which was these tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China that related to fentanyl imports and a public health crisis, was the declared emergency. And again, it does very much beg the question, sort of what is the connection between imports of teddy bears or t-shirts or, any number of other things to fentanyl? I mean, there isn't one, and therefore there isn't this authority. With respect to this now mega IEPA declaration, I think there is still an argument there about what is the connection between imposing a universal tariff on everyone and efforts. So the crisis that's been declared is the trade deficits. And yet the tariffs are going on countries with whom we have a surplus. So again, what's the connection between imposing additional import tariffs on countries with whom we have a surplus? It begs the question about, what's the connection between putting tariffs on least developed countries like Lesotho, where, again, the GDP per capita is less than $3 a day. I mean, how is this going to help us with our trade deficit to make Lesotho poorer when the reason they're not buying anything from the United States is they can't afford it? So again, what is the connection between the measure that's been imposed, tariffs on everyone, and the declared emergency? And thirdly, and again, I think this is where the courts may not be willing to go. I mean, they may give a lot of deference to the president on, if you say it's an emergency, we have to accept that it's an emergency. But there are at least some that are going to contend, what emergency? I mean, we have been running trade deficits since 1975. 50 years of deficits. And the language in the statute under IEPA is that the emergency has to be unusual and extraordinary. And so there may be a challenge saying, how can something be viewed as unusual or extraordinary if it's been happening for 50 years? And the level of the trade deficit as compared to the GDP of the United States is not at an all-time high. I mean, not even close to being at an all-time high. We've had certainly periods in our history, where the trade deficit ratio to the GDP was like 6%. We're not anywhere close to that. So, why is this now an unusual and extraordinary phenomenon that requires this litigation? So, yes, there are all of these arguments that can and will be made in the courts in the United States. There's already been one case filed by, again, largely driven by, an outside nonprofit litigation company, but it is referred to as Simplified v. Trump. This is a small, sort of importer in Florida who has brought this challenge in the Northern District Court of Florida. I do expect, because I'm in touch with a lot of people that are in the throes of putting together their own cases, that there will be a whole series of additional litigation coming. The big question for a lot of the litigants is whether to file these cases in individual district courts throughout the United States, or whether to file them at the Court of International Trade, which is the dedicated court in the United States that typically hears all disputes. And this is a very, again, one of these really problematic legal dilemmas for all of the litigators as to which forum is a better forum for them. It has to do both with the statutory references within the Court of International Trade's jurisdiction. The Court of International Trade has jurisdiction over any laws related to tariffs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if your argument is that IEPA is not a law that relates to tariffs, do you want to be in the Court of International Trade? And on the other hand, there's some benefit to being in the Court of International Trade because they clearly have the power to issue a nationwide injunction over all tariff collection. They have the authority to suspend the liquidation of all of the entries that are covered by the tariff. They would have broader tariff-related remedy. But again, strategic decisions about all of that. So all of those are certainly in discussion with all the people that are getting ready to file. But I think cases are coming. coming. So I do believe that you're going to see, I think, a flood of litigation starting. Partly because, again, companies just cannot afford these levels of duties. This is particularly hard, obviously, on all the small and medium-sized enterprises that cannot shift theirs, that do not have the cash, because we're talking cash payments right now for all of these duties. A lot of these goods were on the water before anybody knew about these. So, I mean, your choice at this point is either come up with the cash to pay for these tariffs today or forfeit the goods. And again, this is just leaving everybody in really difficult positions. So yes, litigation. The other pushbacks are going to come, I do think, from, and you already see it, two different streams of congressional activity. So the one, again, that I think is moving the fastest is for the Congress to simply terminate the emergency of the trade deficits. The reason I say fastest is because there is already this authority within IEEPA. So within the statute itself, there is already established a process that the Congress can pass a simple, it's literally one paragraph, 2 sentences long, resolution that says we terminate this emergency over trade deficits, at which point then the president has no authority to impose these tariffs under it. So again, that is definitely moving. There's more and more members of Congress that are supporting it. Resolutions, again, in the Senate, it has fairly strong support. A Senate resolution has already passed, terminating the emergency with respect to the fentanyl tariffs on Canada. So again, that's already moving. Congressman Meeks on the Democratic side of the House has already, again, introduced this as a privileged resolution in the House of Representatives. But in the House, Speaker Johnson, who is opposed, has a lot of procedural tricks and tools that he might be able to bring to bear to stop this fast track resolution, moving. But again, so one of the congressional lanes, if you will, and to watch for is legislation to terminate the emergency. The second one is a much broader actual, change in U.S. law. Again, that is moving on a bipartisan basis. In the Senate, you now have 7 Republican senators on board to a bill that basically says if the president raises tariffs or if tariffs are raised, again, with exceptions for anti-dumping and countervailing duty, with some exceptions, but if tariffs are raised, the president has to provide notice to the Congress, what he's raising, why he's raising it, and then the Congress has to act. And if they do not approve of the tariffs within 60 days, the tariffs go away. So it's like an automatic sunset of the raising of tariffs unless the Congress approves them. So this is a really strong reassertion of congressional authority over tariffs. And again, I think there's companion bills on the House side to do this. Look, the big problem with this is Trump's going to veto it. And he's already said that, if either of these two pass, if this one, and again, he hasn't made the announcement yet about what he would do if they terminate the IEEPA tariff, if they terminate the emergency. But on this one that says, after 60 days, if Congress hasn't acted, the tariffs go away, the president has made it very clear he's vetoing that bill. So, again, I think it's unlikely that you could get to veto-proof majorities, but again, the sentiment is moving pretty quickly. And as more and more small and medium-sized businesses and more farmers are hurt, and more, again, the stock market keeps crashing, bond rates go up, so the cost of borrowing gets higher. So it makes it harder for the Congress to deal with the budget and the deficits. I don't know 100% where this is going. Again, there's pretty strong sentiment in Congress that too much authority has been delegated. And the question is whether there all of a sudden, there is a higher wave. But again, I think the veto is likely, and I think it will be very hard, particularly in the House of Representatives, to overcome the presidential veto, because most, particularly on the House side, everybody is fairly lockstep. The last thing, I would only add one other item to Wendy's what to watch, because it's slightly tangential, but I think could be extremely significant, which is we expect, and again, we'll see whether these dates slip, on April 17th, so not very far away, for the Trump administration to announce what they're doing under a Section 301 investigation related to ships and shipbuilding. And just to understand what they've basically proposed is that there would be a fee of either 1.5 million or $1 million per ship that enters into any US ports if that ship is flagged from China, was built in China, was brought in, operated by a company who has purchased ships from China, or who has put orders in the order book for their ships to be built in China. I don't know that we know all of the data, but I read somewhere that would be covering somewhere in the order of 80 to 90% of all ships coming into all ports in the United States would now have to pay if this is the road that they take. Again, I will say this is what they have proposed. This is what they've had a hearing on. This is what they're working on. But the notion would be that every ship that, again, has these connections to China paying 1.5 million or $1 million per entry into the US ports. So again, just another one to be on the watch for on your list.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That's fantastic. Fascinating to get that from you. And I think our friends around the world will really appreciate your sharing that briefing with them. It's very, very useful and helpful. Now I'll turn to Alan. Alan, my sort of starter questions for you are related to the WTO, which is, I guess, our raison d'etre. So I'd like to come to you now and say, or ask you whether you see a role for the WTO in these rather strange circumstances that we find ourselves in, or is the WTO now completely redundant, or as our friend Hector Torres, I think has been on the call. He argued in the Financial Times recently, is this exactly the right time to reform the WTO? And then finally, noting the recent USTR report on the WTO at 30, do you think that there's any real appetite in the US government for WTO reform right now, or they just want to ignore it? Over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I benefited greatly from my three colleagues who have spoken eloquently and very completely. And I have actually nothing to disagree with in anything they said. Phenomenal summaries of where we stand today. Oddly, the juxtaposition is April 10th, known as tomorrow, the WTO is celebrating its 30th birthday. And it comes at a time when the world's attention is actually not on celebrating the 30th birthday of the WTO. So what will I say to my friends at the WTO? I'd say first, which has been covered very significantly in this discussion, where are the brakes on U.S. conduct? And my colleagues here have spoken in some detail as to, when does it all stop? And part of the correction, it is said in this country, is the stock market. And the stock market continues to plummet. And it won't probably like very much the decoupling tariffs that have come from China and the US side, which is very dramatic. So there's the effect of the markets. Secondly, there's the Congress, and Jennifer has outlined what's going on up there. The introduction of a bill is not the same thing as passage of a bill, And even when this fast track, so-called, which has delivered enormous benefits over time to trade negotiations approval, uh, uh, the Democratic Congress, Nancy Pelosi, took fast track off of its track when they wanted to do it. So, as Jennifer said, there is the ability to stop something which otherwise looks certain to gain momentum. And there isn't, the momentum is not quite there yet. It's building. Uh, you asked Bill, and I shoved this off onto him about the reaction of business. Well, the bankers are quite upset. Elon Musk is quite upset. In other words, the big industrialists are beginning to speak out. Those who are concerned about the economy writ large are upset, and the smaller fry, the smaller people, medium-sized businesses, they go to their congressman and they go to the White House quietly, um, not making big denunciations of the president, which has potential costs, but instead there's a lot of mail coming into the Congress and telephone calls saying, "What are you doing?" So that's building, and eventually may come out in a change in policy. The courts. We'll see how that turns out. I tend to think that this question is really a very bald one. You look at the Constitution and you say, look at that. The tariff power seems to be in Article 1, which is the Congress, the legislature, and not in Article 2, but all the action is coming from the president. And was this delegated? And Jennifer's laid out the reasons why not so much. And I think any Supreme Court opinion is going to sound a lot like, ultimately, if they turn against the president, is going to sound a lot like what Jennifer outlined. They'll use those arguments, but I think fundamentally the switch that gets thrown is a decision that this just goes too far. My initial feeling back when sounded like a Lighthizer approach, a 10 or 20% global tariff and a 60% tariff on China, which that's what Trump campaigned on, that the blanket tariff, the 10 or 20% tariff, wouldn't fly as a presidential action. But you could argue that under IEEPA, the International Economic Powers Emergency Act, that when it's China, that's a different sort of thing. It's a geopolitical rivalry. They throw things at each other. They take measures against each other, and the 60% tariff might pass muster, or at least the Congress would be more. The court, Supreme Court, would be more deferential to the president when it comes to geopolitical issues or geopolitical rivalry. But the blanket tariff wouldn't pass muster. But on April 2nd and 9th, today, the president blew that up with so many tariffs against so many, and Jennifer said Lesotho, poor fellows, and Madagascar for that matter, getting hit, that the entire tariff power of the United States apparently was transferred, according to the White House, from the Congress to the president. I don't think that'll stand. Now, what should the WTO do? It is doing things. For example, there is dispute settlement. There are panels that will be formed. There'll be complaints. Unfortunately, for resolution of this particular issue, the United States is not really a participant, because when it gets to a stage of finality at the panel stage, it won't go to a successful appeal, because there is no appeal, because it appeals into the void. And 5 years ago, the Trump administration, under Lighthizer hand, stop the process of nominations to the appellate body. So there are no breaks for the United States. in that sense at the WTO. Now, what happened when the U.S. put on an import surcharge in 1971 is that the members, the contracting parties to the GATT, formed a working party. And on a very short fuse, they said, report in less than a month. This was not an Article 23 working party. This first working party was to discuss what the U.S. had done, a 10% surcharge, and it put the WTO in, well, then in the GATT, put the GATT in the game that members, trade ministers, ambassadors at the WTO said we have to discuss, was there a balance of payments emergency? We're going to ask the IMF about that. What's the U.S. done? What other measures has it taken? What's this all about? And they engaged. And I'd say if the WTO does not engage at this stage, it's missing a bit. Now, how should it structure that working party or working party-like review? My preference is that this be a horizontal trade policy review. What's that mean? Don't look at this as we're going to have a special TPR about the United States, trade policy review of the United States. We're taking a trade policy review of the situation. What's the situation? There is the United States going off the rails on all of its tariff obligations and more. And there are folks retaliating, and there are deals being struck that are discriminatory. And we read about them in the newspaper. We really don't know what they are because they're not confirmed. There's no reporting requirement and I'd say we create one at the WTO. At trade policy review, we take an ambassador and we put him at the head of the chairing this review, and we have a discussant or two or three who appear in their individual capacities, and they have a good look at what's going on in the world. Because what the WTO, one of the things the WTO provided in its history was transparency to the extent it could. And transparency sunshine is a disinfectant. And it's essential that the WTO step forward. And, if it had let's say, a working party that was a combination or even litigation under Article 23 that's all against the United States, chances are you just force the United States out and you learn nothing. You have a condemnation of the United States. It leaves the party. And what have you gained? You feel better about it, but you haven't learned what's going on. There will be side deals cut that may be even private and personal investments made. And the world has to know that. So I strongly urge that the WTO find a way, and it might have to have a vote in order to get there, because one member or another, even the U.S. not paying its dues, may still raise its flag and object at this stage to forming any sort of TPR, trade policy review, with respect to looking at what's going on in the world, even if doesn't say it's about the U.S., when in large part it's about the U.S. But it's imperative that members know what is happening, that Japan know what Korea has done, that Korea know what Japan has done, or Europe, or anybody else of the 50 or 70 who are cutting deals. So of course, the default is have a general council meeting. And every ambassador gets 4 minutes to say whatever's on his or her mind, and with no effect, and they go home thinking they've done something. They haven't done anything at all. It's the same way of the U.S. Congress. Every deliberative body has this problem of deliberating with no particular effect. Now, Hector's idea, which I agree with, this is the third part of my comments, which is it is time to take a look at the institution. And the U.S. will say, and India will say, no, it isn't. So it has to be pushed through beyond that. And I had a number of ideas which were in the bestseller, Revitalizing the World Trading System, 2023, in Cambridge University Press. And I might say, how much as I like Cambridge University Press, don't expect them to be flogging this book around the world. That's not happening. And they're only $150 a copy for the hardcover, and they don't fly off the shelf, in case anyone wonders. It's just a side. I certainly wouldn't take this personally, but I introduced that. However, I put it in a lot of speeches. What should we have as a reformed WTO? I mean, real reform. Members must be able to conclude agreements. We all know that, and do it at the WTO and register at the WTO formally. Something as limp-wristed in terms of the world economy's problems. And I'm all for it, but the investment facilitation for agreement not going to change the world dramatically, but it's a good thing, and we can't get it formally adopted. That has to change. The non-participant veto has to end. The restoration of binding dispute settlement for all members needs to be negotiated. There never was a negotiation, and all of the problems inherent in the original sin of not thinking through how the WTO should be put together, namely should have a legislative function, an executive function, and a judicial function. It's time to have a real negotiation now, which hasn't taken place, on getting the dispute settlement back on track. Effective governance of the organization. The bank and the fund don't try to meet all members in a big room and see what they can do. They have boards of executive directors. Used to have a green room or CG18, all sorts of configurations of the WTO. So we've gone to the I think there may be a canton in Switzerland that still has voting by everyone marching into the city square in order to vote. Well, that's the WTO has emulated that remaining canton, if it still does that. That's total nonsense. You need a board of executive directors. Then you need actually an executive leader called the Director General, the president of the World Bank, the managing director of the IMF. They make proposals. They say it's time to have a $50 million fund for, or $50 billion, whatever, for dealing with issues involving global warming, or we need a replenishment of our resources. And I go to the last point. So we need a real executive. No organization, any social club in any country usually has some officers who do things to organize the agenda and make proposals. We need that at the WTO. Lastly, funding. And Mario can tell us all about it, but having a source of funds is a useful thing when you're going about your business. At the WTO, you have India and the United States torturing the chairman of the budget committee and the WTO on a regular basis in order to control the agenda. Well, that has to stop. World trade's too important to be left to backroom use of leverage. There was probably it would surprise you who it was. The sharpest American critic of the WTO said on the record, if the WTO did not exist, we would have to invent it. That's interesting, because order is much better than chaos. And even some in the United States might understand that. And living by those rules is imperative. And then strengthening those rules is also imperative. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alan. You kind of introduced a note of common sense and plain sanity on the WTO front, which is extremely welcome. Thank you very much. And good luck with persuading Cambridge University Press to to reduce the price of the book. I mean, that would be a big contribution itself. Well, look, everybody, it's been a fantastic session. I know we've gone on a bit longer than we intended to originally, but I think the presentations have been so fascinating and so informative, and lots of insights there. I mean, we could spend days on this. We really could, investigating and going down various channels that have been mentioned. Lots of things come to my mind, but given the time that we now have, we have about 15 minutes or maybe a little bit longer if our panelists can stay with us a little bit longer, but I can't trespass on their goodwill for too long. I think what I'm going to do now is maybe open the floor, because I think there must be lots of people who would like to say something. I see Hamid's got his hand up, but can I just ask Hector, did you want to chip in? Because we've been taking your name in vain. I mentioned it, Alan mentioned it on the WTO reform front. So maybe Hector, I'll just give you a couple of minutes if you would like to. No requirement, of course.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, well, just the point is that we know that the WTO needs a reform, and either it reforms or it vanishes, it dies somehow. The point is that, can we envisage reform without building trust first? Or the alternative is, can we start rebuilding trust by agreeing on avenues for reforms? Basically, it is clear that without trust, we cannot agree. It's not the time to agree on substance of reform, but we can agree on the process of reform. And the fact of starting that process could somehow bring some confidence that it could be done. And of course, there's a synergetic relation between, like a bicycle, you start moving and you find some equilibrium there, and you find a way to go ahead. So the intention of my short press article, of course, I picked up only two subjects, which are, you know, which they are. There are many other subjects that may be even more necessary than those two subjects. But well, first of all, I only had 650 words or 30 words, so I couldn't say much more than that. But I chose those because, in my experience, the fact that we are identifying at the WTO consensus as virtual unanimity is killing the organization. And consensus did work at some time because there were green rooms. And there was consensus plus collegial spirit at the green rooms. Of course, many countries that were not invited to the green rooms were complaining with good reasons. But you can have consensus if you have some affectio societatis, or some collegial spirit, and you have a limited group of countries going into those exercises of consensus. And of course, as you said, Stuart, the DG doesn't have to be simply someone to serve members. There's no reason that the member-driven mantra would exclude the fact that the DG could take some initiatives. And so I would say it is the time to go the extra mile. I know that the DG is not very much appreciated by ambassadors because she doesn't play in the league of ambassadors. She's a policymaker. She played in the lead of policymakers. So she can pick up the phone and speak with policymakers. Ambassadors in Geneva don't like that, and I can understand it. But at this time, that is very necessary. Precisely, this is the time in which we need those kind of things. So my little message would be, let's try to figure out together what kind of first steps can we give on process to help rebuilding the basic confidence that is necessary to move into substance. We cannot move into substance at once. That's very clear. But we can find some hopefully some way to rebuild confidence by agreeing on the process of reform. That would be my small message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hector. Hamid, please.
Well, thank you so much. Excellent presentations and very enriching. I have two questions really for the panelists all. The first is what we're seeing now from coming out of the White House makes one wonder as to whether the objective of Trump and the Trump administration now is to create a certain environment of control, as opposed to having a clear idea about what concrete outcomes they want to achieve. So there is a creation of a certain condition now of almost panic, which means that the concrete outcomes are not really clear, particularly since the scope of bargaining now goes beyond tariffs, as we know, but even sometimes goes beyond trade itself. So that makes the situation a bit unpredictable, and therefore, whether that perception is correct, that would be nice to confirm. The other question really is about WTO reform and the ideas, and I agree with what Alan and Hector said about the necessity of that. We've been talking about the necessity of WTO reform now for the past more than 10 years. But at this particular point, should we distinguish in our minds two separate lines of conversation or two separate lines of analysis? One is the firefighting conversation about how to react to what's coming out of the White House, and the other line of conversation is WTO reform and what can be done about that. The reason for that separation is that we might fall into the trap of thinking that at this particular point, the US is really interested in WTO reform, and I don't think they are at this point. There is a need for clarity on this point, because if the US, and we agree that the US is not interested in WTO reform at this point, then this conversation should take place in a very constructive way, not with any hostility towards the US, of course, but to construct some preliminary vision about how WTO reform can be approached without waiting for the US to be an active participant in that conversation. Hopefully, they will come on board at some point. But the urgency of the matter makes it necessary for those who care about the system to start really thinking about how can we address the current challenges in the hope that the US may come on board. Now, the perception and what the panelists think about that, I think, would be very useful for us in Geneva, watching what's going on inside the WTO. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Hamid. Great. Would any of the panelists like to respond on these points from Hector and Hamid?
I'm gonna have to leave shortly, so maybe I'll just quickly try and respond to Hamid's first point, which I think is excellent. And this is something that should concern everyone coming to Washington trying to seek a negotiated outcome or some kind of outcome with the Trump administration. And that is, I don't think they exactly know what they want out of individual countries. I think there's certain themes like, get rid of your non-tariff measures, reduce your tariffs, invest more in the US, buy more from the US. But again, as I mentioned earlier, I think this negotiating dynamic is going to be a strange one in that the onus is going to be, the onus will be put on countries coming to Washington of what can you do for us? And then I think our negotiators, even at the cabinet level, are going to have to then go to the White House and get, approval here. And Trump will probably come back and say, no, we need more. And so at least in the, the coming, days and weeks, I think this is going to be a very messy process. And I think it may even lead to more mistrust among certain countries that feel like, they have been forthcoming with unilateral measures or unilateral announcements. And again, this is why I think it's so important to see who's first out of the box. What does that first deal look like? Because that will, again, be extremely instructive. But I think now if you ask different Trump advisors of what needs to be in this deal, I think you'd get very different answers. So with that, I'll turn to others.
Can I also weigh in, because I too unfortunately have a hard stop at 9:30. I would just basically try to combine both what Wendy has just said and Alan's comments. To me, where the WTO could be the most helpful, I think, is in providing some transparency and providing a forum where countries can compare notes. Because my concern is not just for the big countries, but it is, what do countries like Lesotho at a 50% tariff, or many of the other LDCs, particularly in Africa, that got very high rates because this is all calculated on this stupid idea of your trade deficit with the United States. So a lot of the very poor countries that simply don't buy very much from the United States ended up getting hit with the highest tariffs. So my own view is to try to at least figure out whether the WTO could help create little, if you will, mini clubs or mini groups that have some similarly situated problems to come up with more of a collective approach with the vis-a-vis the United States. Because particularly for a lot of those smaller countries, they're going to be at the back of the queue. I mean, let's just be honest. And they don't have very much to offer. I mean, they can't make more investments in the United States. They can't buy more from the United States. So I do think, A, providing transparency, and B, providing a real ability to collectively get together at the WTO to try to figure out what is a better sort of negotiating strategy or approach might be something that the WTO could provide to be of real service. Also, just technically, I mean, to make sure countries really do understand, kind of, what their tariffs are, what our tariffs are. I mean, again, just to make sure everyone who you can help arm that is on the sort of least developing country side of the table is given as much technical support to walk into these negotiations as could be provided, might be something else the WTO could do to help.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and also earlier to Wendy. I guess we're running out of time, and our panelists are saying they need to leave. Bill or Alan, do you want to just have a final word?
I just say, Hilda put in the chat, the developing countries are going to lose out, what's sort of echoing what, in a way, what Wendy was saying, and they will. Lack of information, lack of any real support. I think that if the WTO fails to step forward, and if it just pursues what is the norm, which is countries that can will file Article 23 cases, and the issue will only be not what the systemic response should be, what the system should look like. The only issue will be, was the U.S. legitimate in what it did, and then potentially were there those who retaliated, others who retaliated if the U.S. counterclaims, if they're in the process. Whether the non-MFN responses were within the rules, and that will not advance anything, frankly, other than countries will want the justification that the WTO process worked, that a decision was handed down, that there was illegitimacy in the U.S. action, and potentially there might be some illegitimacy found on the part of others. But we won't know all that's taken place. There may be, this system is not only going to exclude the WTO, the least developed countries and the less developed countries, it's also going to be ripe for corruption. And the lack of transparency will lead to further corruption.
Thanks, Alan. Bill.
Well, Stuart, we're at time, and I think the right thing to do is to let you have the last word. So go ahead.
Thanks very much, Bill. Yeah. Well, yeah, unfortunately, we are out of time, I think. There was one question that I was hoping to turn to in the Q&A, which was a question from Fakri Al-Haizama. I don't know whether I pronounced that correctly, about the possible impact of de-dollarization following the tariffs and how that would affect international trade. But I'm sorry, we basically have run out of time, so I don't think we can answer that right now. But it's an interesting question that I just thought I would draw attention to, and we're starting to get quite a few comments in the Q&A from various members, which is very interesting. I think all I can say really by way of summing up is that it's been a really informative and insightful session. I've learned a lot. I think we've all learned a lot. Of course, it's a moving target. We don't know really where this is going, and we'll have to, amongst the friends, we'll have to follow up and try to find our way forward and keep tabs on all of this. We're deeply grateful to our panelists, to Bill and Wendy and Jennifer and Alan for sparing their valuable time to talk to us about all of this, and I'm sure we'll follow up, especially on the WTO front. There's been some interesting ideas about transparency and the need to sort of talk collectively about what's going on, institutional reform, possibly, yes. And also, the US has laid out what it sees as the problems with the WTO in that report on the WTO at 30. So there's a huge amount to follow up on, but I'm afraid for today, we've run out of time. We've had quite a large audience by our standards, which I think is fantastic, and I hope you've all enjoyed it and appreciate that our panelists have given us a lot to think about. So with that, Mario, I will draw the session to a close, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.